The moment of reckoning had arrived. Sarah Collins felt a chill race down her spine as the intercom crackled to life. "Senior flight attendant Sarah Collins, please report to the cockpit immediately." The first-class cabin, once filled with quiet luxury, was now laced with tension. Passengers exchanged knowing glances, some whispering, others merely watching. Sarah swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her ears. As she stepped into the cockpit, Captain Reynolds' expression was stone-cold. He didn't waste time. "Do you have any idea who you just threw off this flight?" His voice was sharp, controlled, but filled with a quiet fury. Sarah blinked, confused. "What? He was just some guy who didn't belong in first class." Reynolds exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the flight log. "That guy is Jordan Williams. He owns 30% of this airline, and now, thanks to you, we're facing the biggest PR disaster in company history." Sarah's stomach dropped. The color drained from her face as the weight of her mistake crushed her. She hadn't just humiliated a passenger. She had humiliated the man who could end her entire career with a single phone call. Outside the cockpit, passengers whispered, phones buzzed, and social media erupted. The world was watching, and Jordan Williams, he was just getting started. But before we dive deeper into this explosive story, let me ask you, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below, and if you're loving this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Jordan Williams stood at the edge of the crowded shelter kitchen, wiping his brow with a napkin as the scent of freshly made stew filled the air. The hum of quiet conversations and the clatter of plates created a rhythm that had become familiar to him over the years. It was Wednesday afternoon, and as it had been for the past 6 years, he was spending his time volunteering at the local homeless shelter. As a 40-year-old billionaire tech mogul, Jordan could have been on a private jet, attending high-profile meetings or vacationing on a yacht. But instead, he stood in the simple kitchen of Hope Haven, surrounded by strangers whose lives had been shaped by hardship just as his had been. For Jordan, there was no need to flaunt his success. He had long learned that true happiness wasn't found in the luxury of mansions, cars, or private events. True happiness came from giving back, from finding fulfillment in helping those who had none of the privileges he was born into. As a child, Jordan's family had struggled to make ends meet. There were days when meals were scarce, when the power would go out because his mother couldn't afford the bill. Those memories weighed heavily on him, but they also motivated him to make something of himself, not for the wealth, but to ensure that he never lost sight of the person he was before success arrived. The car he drove was a modest Toyota Camry, the same one he'd bought in his 20s. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't impressive, but it worked, and it gave him the freedom to go where he needed without drawing attention. His wardrobe consisted mostly of simple, comfortable clothing, jeans, t-shirts, and hoodies, often adorned with faded logos from his favorite bands or charities he supported. He had no desire to parade his wealth in front of others, especially not when there were people who needed real help. Jordan had lived in the same small, 3-bedroom house for the past 5 years. It wasn't grand, but it was cozy and comfortable. He could have bought a mansion, built a sprawling estate, but the idea never appealed to him. Instead, he focused his energy on the work he truly cared about, giving back to the community, offering financial support to causes that helped children, veterans, and those struggling with addiction. The life he had now felt far richer than any mansion or high-rise office ever could. Driving to the shelter each Wednesday, Jordan often reflected on his past. How far he had come from the young boy who sat in the back of a run-down apartment, his mother telling him to never give up. He understood now that it was his experiences, his struggles, that had molded him into the person he was. The drive, the grit, the need to rise above. It had all been about more than material wealth. It had been about proving to himself and the world that no matter where you start, you can always choose to make your life about something bigger. As he parked his car and grabbed his worn backpack from the passenger seat, Jordan took a deep breath. The shelter's doors opened and he stepped inside, ready to serve, not as a billionaire or a tech mogul, but simply as a man who had never forgotten the value of a kind gesture or a listening ear. Jordan often found himself reflecting on his late mother's words as he made his way through life. She had instilled in him a simple yet profound truth. One's worth isn't defined by what you own, but by how you treat others. He had learned this lesson early when his family struggled just to keep the lights on. He remembered the nights they ate dinner in silence, the quiet fear that lingered in the air when his mother couldn't pay the bills. She had always put on a brave face, telling him and his siblings that material things were fleeting, but love, kindness, and integrity were what mattered most in the end. Jordan's mother never had the luxury of wealth, but she had always managed to make their home feel like the safest, most caring place in the world. Even when they didn't have enough food, she made sure they shared what little they had with others, neighbors, friends, anyone in need. Jordan often found himself thinking of her in moments of quiet reflection. He remembered how she'd greet each new person with the same warmth, the same care, no matter their appearance or social standing. She was the embodiment of a truth that Jordan had embraced wholeheartedly. Wealth, he believed, wasn't measured by bank accounts or material possessions. True wealth came from one's ability to be generous with their time, their love, and their respect for others. This philosophy shaped every decision Jordan made. It was why he chose to live the life he did, free from the distractions of flaunting his success. The world around him may have been obsessed with appearances, but he understood that real success wasn't about what you owned or how many people knew your name. It was about the impact you had on others, especially when no one was watching. As he stepped into the volunteer kitchen that afternoon, Jordan was reminded of these principles once again. The shelter was crowded with people, some regulars and others new faces looking for help, but each one deserving of kindness. The work he did here, serving food and offering a listening ear, felt more meaningful to him than any high-profile business deal. Jordan could have easily walked away from the struggles of others, left the homeless shelter to the hands of those who had no other choice but to help. Instead, he stayed. He stayed because he knew that his worth, his true success, lay in the simple act of offering something as precious as his time to people who had none to waste. Despite his wealth, Jordan never allowed himself to stand apart from those in need. He was just another traveler. That's how he saw himself. When he traveled for work, Jordan kept a low profile, wearing the same casual clothes he wore when volunteering, blending in with the crowd. In the airport terminal, no one knew who he was. He wasn't the man with billions in his bank account. He was the guy waiting in line like everyone else, just another person going about his day. His wealth didn't make him special in those moments. It didn't elevate him above the people around him. In fact, he often took comfort in being invisible, unnoticed. He didn't need the attention. He didn't need the accolades. His heart knew the value of making the world a better place, one person at a time. To Jordan, wealth wasn't about the lavish homes, private jets, or exotic vacations that so many billionaires seemed obsessed with. It wasn't about the things that could be seen. Wealth, in its truest form, was about relationships, about the impact you had on others, and about the difference you could make in the lives of those who might never be able to repay you. He remembered his mother's smile when she would give away the last of their food, even when she herself went hungry. It wasn't an act of charity to her. It was a way of life, helping, sharing, caring. These were the true measures of wealth. Jordan had made it a point to stay grounded, not allowing his success to define him, but rather his actions. His wealth was a tool he used to improve the lives of others, not something to hide behind. This perspective allowed him to navigate the world with humility, seeing each person he met as deserving of respect, regardless of their social or financial standing. As he handed a warm plate of food to a man sitting in the corner of the shelter, Jordan felt the truth of his mother's teachings resonate within him. The smile the man gave him in return was worth more than any business deal, more than any luxury item. It was a reminder that in the grand scheme of things, the moments that truly mattered were those spent helping others. That, in itself, was the greatest wealth he would ever know. As Jordan made his way down the narrow aisle toward the first-class cabin, the hum of the airplane's engines seemed distant, drowned out by the quiet murmurs of passengers settling into their seats. His worn backpack was slung over his shoulder, and his simple jeans and faded t-shirt were a stark contrast to the crisp suits and polished attire of most of the passengers in the business class section. To anyone who didn't know him, Jordan could easily have been mistaken for just another traveler. Ordinary, unassuming, and blending in with the crowd. But for Sarah Collins, who had worked for the airline for over a decade, it was the little things that caught her attention. The way he walked with the kind of quiet confidence that didn't scream for attention. The way his casual attire, jeans and a plain shirt, seemed out of place in a section where passengers typically donned tailored suits or designer dresses. There was something about him that didn't seem right, something that caused her to pause. At 30 years old, Sarah had spent years working her way up the ranks in the airline industry. She had started as a junior flight attendant, cleaning cabins and assisting passengers, but through sheer dedication and a natural ability to command authority, she had earned her current position as senior flight attendant on this route. The uniform she wore was always pristine, her hair perfectly styled, and her posture unwaveringly upright, all symbols of the power she felt she had earned over the years. Working on the premium flights, she had grown accustomed to serving the elite passengers. Wealthy businessmen, celebrities, and powerful figures. She had developed a sense of entitlement, an unconscious belief that some passengers were more deserving of the privileges first class offered than others. So when Sarah noticed Jordan walking toward her in his humble attire, something inside her snapped. He doesn't belong here, she thought instantly. In her mind, someone who didn't bother with a suit and tie couldn't possibly have the means to sit in the luxurious first-class cabin. Her gaze followed him as he passed other first-class passengers who were comfortably settled, their designer luggage in the overhead compartments, their faces exuding the unmistakable air of affluence. Jordan, on the other hand, looked out of place, a man who had no business being here. As he reached the entrance to the first-class section, Sarah's patience wore thin. The polite, professional greeting she normally offered was replaced by a sharp tone. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice cutting through the air with authority. The passengers around her turned to look, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. "This is the first-class cabin," Sarah emphasized, her words lingering in the air like a challenge. "I'll need to see your boarding pass." Jordan blinked in surprise. He had flown first class many times, and he had never encountered such an abrasive reception. Yet he remained calm, his usual grace unshaken. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his boarding pass, offering it to her without a word. The others around him were watching, some unsure, others uncomfortable, as Sarah snatched the pass from his hand, her eyes scanning it with an air of suspicion. She didn't bother with the usual small talk or pleasantries. Instead, she scrutinized the ticket with such intensity that it seemed as if she were looking for signs of forgery. "You've flown first class before?" Sarah's voice was laced with disbelief. She didn't even look at him as she spoke, her gaze still fixed on the boarding pass as if it could somehow reveal a deeper truth. The other passengers remained silent, sensing the tension between the two. Jordan nodded gently. "Yes, I fly first class regularly." Sarah arched an eyebrow, not convinced. She was used to passengers who looked the part, those who could afford the luxury of first class because they wore it like a badge of honor, but Jordan didn't look like that. His jeans were faded, his shoes well worn from use. He carried himself with an air of ease that didn't fit her idea of what a first-class passenger should be. Her mind raced with assumptions. Was he some kind of imposter? Did he think he could just buy a seat in first class without earning it the right way? "These tickets cost thousands of dollars, sir," she said, her voice dripping with skepticism. "I don't think you quite understand what section you're in." Jordan felt the sting of her words, but didn't let it show. He had grown used to people making assumptions about him, his wealth, his background, and now, it seemed, his presence in first class. But this wasn't about him. It was about the pattern he had seen time and again, the tendency for people to judge others based on superficial factors, clothing, appearance, mannerisms, things that didn't define who a person truly was. "I assure you I'm in the right seat," Jordan said softly, his voice calm and steady. Sarah took a step back, her hand moving to her phone. She clicked it open and dialed security, her fingers pressing the buttons with unnecessary force. "I don't feel comfortable with this situation," she muttered under her breath. I need someone to come check this passenger out." Jordan didn't react, not even a flicker of emotion crossing his face. He simply stood there, holding his ground. He didn't need to argue, he didn't need to prove himself. He knew who he was, and he knew what he was worth. His character, not the clothes he wore or the assumptions people made about him. As the two airport security officers appeared at the entrance to first class, Sarah pointed to Jordan, her voice rising with a hint of command. "This passenger needs to leave the plane. His ticket doesn't add up, and I don't feel comfortable with him staying on board." One of the security officers glanced at the boarding pass, then at Jordan's calm demeanor. "Ma'am, the ticket appears valid," the officer said quietly, but Sarah wasn't hearing him. "I don't care what it appears to be," Sarah snapped, her hands clenching into fists. "I've worked this route for over 10 years. I know what I'm dealing with." The security officers exchanged a glance, clearly uncertain, but they followed Sarah's lead. "Sir, we'll need you to gather your things and come with us." Jordan nodded, a quiet dignity in his movements as he retrieved his backpack from the overhead compartment. He knew that, at this moment, arguing or raising his voice wouldn't change anything, but as he made his way back down the aisle, he caught the eyes of several passengers, eyes that conveyed a mix of discomfort, confusion, and sympathy. It wasn't lost on him that while Sarah had been quick to judge, the passengers saw the truth of the situation. Jordan's heart was heavy, but not with anger. He knew that some battles weren't won through confrontation, but through quiet resolve. As the security officers escorted him off the plane, he walked with his head held high, determined not to let this encounter define him. Sarah held Jordan's boarding pass up to the harsh overhead light, her eyes narrowing as she examined every detail with precision. She turned it slightly, as though searching for some hidden flaw, some sign that the ticket might be forged or fraudulent. She ran her fingers along the edge of the paper, tapping it between her fingertips as if she could somehow detect a discrepancy through touch alone. In the back of her mind, a single thought kept repeating, "Someone like him can't afford this." She muttered quietly to herself, just loud enough for Jordan to hear. "I've never seen someone like him in first class. Not in all my years on this route, it's just not right." Her voice was laced with disbelief, her words barely containing the contempt she felt. Jordan, standing quietly, felt a flush of discomfort rising in his chest. He had been in this situation before. People assuming, judging, deciding who he was without ever bothering to ask. It was always the same. People saw what they wanted to see, based on nothing more than appearances, but it stung every time. He glanced around the cabin. The other passengers who had been watching the exchange with mild curiosity now seemed fully aware of what was happening. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing away as if they were avoiding a scene they didn't want to be part of. Others pretended to focus on their books or devices, but Jordan could feel their eyes lingering on him, sensing the tension that was building. He could tell they were all aware of the unfairness of the situation, but none of them spoke up. It was always the same when it came to these kinds of moments. Too many people were willing to let injustice slide in the name of convenience. I don't mean to be rude, but I've worked this route for over 10 years, Sarah continued, her voice tinged with superiority. I've never seen you on this flight before. This seat costs thousands of dollars. I've seen the credit cards people use to pay for this. And you don't look like the typical first-class customer. Jordan felt the weight of her words more than the scrutiny of her eyes. She didn't need to explain what she meant. He knew exactly what she was implying. Her assumptions were clear. A man dressed in simple clothes, carrying a well-worn backpack, couldn't possibly have the means to sit in first class. In her mind, first class was reserved for the polished, the wealthy, those who looked the part. "Assure you," Jordan said, his voice steady, though there was an edge of discomfort behind it. "I purchased this ticket in the same manner as any other passenger. I fly first class regularly. This is my seat, just like anyone else's." Despite his calm response, Sarah didn't relent. She snatched the boarding pass from his hand once more, studying it again, this time holding it up to the light as though it were some criminal evidence. Her actions became increasingly condescending, every movement signaling that she thought Jordan had somehow cheated the system, and she was determined to find out how. The cabin fell silent. the tension thickening with each passing moment. "Are you sure about that?" Sarah asked, her tone more biting now. "First class isn't for everyone, you know. And I'm just doing my job by making sure no one sneaks in where they don't belong." Jordan's patience began to fray, but he held himself together. He didn't need to defend himself. He didn't need to explain why he belonged in that seat. But the longer Sarah stood there, scrutinizing him like an intruder, the more uncomfortable he felt. It wasn't the disbelief in her voice that stung. It was the lack of basic respect. She wasn't asking questions to understand his situation. She was making accusations based on the narrowest of assumptions. He glanced at her for a moment, holding her gaze, willing her to see the absurdity of what was happening. But Sarah didn't back down. Instead, her eyes narrowed further as she pulled out her phone. "I'm calling security," she muttered, her fingers tapping the screen with a sharp finality. "This doesn't seem right." Jordan's stomach dropped. He knew what was coming next. Sarah had already made up her mind. She wasn't interested in listening to him, in understanding him. She had already decided that he didn't belong. Within minutes, 2 airport security officers arrived at the first-class cabin. Sarah pointed to Jordan without hesitation. "This passenger's story isn't adding up," she said firmly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that only comes from someone who believes they are always right. "I need him removed. This is a security concern." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, obviously taken aback by the sharpness in Sarah's voice. One officer glanced at Jordan's boarding pass again, his brow furrowing as he read the details. "Ma'am, this ticket appears valid," the officer said cautiously, trying to de-escalate the situation. But Sarah wasn't having it. She raised her chin slightly, a look of finality in her eyes. "I don't care what it appears to be," she snapped. "I'm the senior flight attendant here, and I'm telling you this passenger is not supposed to be in first class. I'm requesting that he be removed immediately." The officers hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. They could see Jordan's ticket was legitimate, but they also knew Sarah's word carried weight on the plane. Reluctantly, they moved toward Jordan. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to gather your belongings and come with us." Jordan didn't argue. He didn't try to protest. He stood slowly, his body stiff, feeling the humiliation of the moment. His face remained neutral, but inside his emotions churned. As he reached up to retrieve his bag from the overhead compartment, he could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, some of them glancing away quickly, others trying to pretend this was normal. But it wasn't normal. It was injustice, and despite how calm he appeared on the outside, it stung more than he cared to admit. Sarah stood off to the side, her posture now straight and rigid, as if she had accomplished something important. She watched Jordan walk past her, not a flicker of apology in her eyes, only the cold satisfaction of someone who believed they had made the right call. As Jordan walked down the aisle, escorted by the security officers, he held his head high. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to let Sarah's ignorance control the narrative. But as he passed by her, his gaze met hers for a brief moment. She didn't look at him with remorse, with regret, only with a sense of self-satisfaction. He stepped off the plane quietly, his chest heavy with the weight of what had just happened. The humiliation wasn't about being removed from the plane. It was about how someone like Sarah could see someone like him and decide, without any real reason, that he didn't belong. As the plane lifted into the sky, Sarah Collins allowed herself a small sense of victory. She straightened her uniform, ran a hand through her perfectly styled hair, and watched as the first-class cabin slowly returned to normal. The smooth hum of the engines became a soothing background noise, and she let out a quiet sigh of relief. She had handled the situation. After all, she had done her job, right? In Sarah's mind, everything had unfolded just as it should have. She had spotted an anomaly, a passenger who didn't belong in first class. Someone who, in her professional opinion, didn't fit the profile of what a first-class customer should be. The man had been too casual, too ordinary. Her instincts told her that something was off, and her quick thinking had removed the threat from the cabin. Sarah couldn't see it, but she believed she had simply upheld the high standards of first-class service. She smiled to herself, a sense of smug satisfaction washing over her. "I keep the standards high," she muttered under her breath, thinking about how important her role was in maintaining the integrity of the premium cabins. The tension she had created was gone, and the cabin was once again peaceful. Yet as Sarah gazed around, a few passengers were looking at her with subtle discomfort, whispering quietly to one another. Some were still visibly unsettled, their eyes lingering on the door where Jordan had been escorted off the plane. It wasn't hard for Sarah to notice. Though they hadn't said anything directly, their unease was palpable. The atmosphere in the cabin, while calm on the surface, was tense. But Sarah chose to ignore it. The murmurs were just people trying to avoid confrontation, and after all, she was in charge here. She wasn't going to let a few whispered words shake her confidence. The situation had been handled in her mind, and that was the end of it. She moved about the cabin with her usual practiced grace, distributing drinks and snacks, her professionalism shielding her from any lingering discomfort. The tension, however, didn't disappear as easily as Sarah had hoped. The passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, pretending to read or scroll through their phones, but the awkwardness hung thick in the air. As the flight continued on its course, Sarah tried to push the unsettling feeling from her mind, focusing instead on her duties. But it didn't help that the faces of the passengers were still occasionally looking toward her with an unmistakable unease, some still talking in hushed tones. She kept moving, forcing herself to believe that she had done the right thing. It wasn't until about 20 minutes later, when the cabin settled into a gentle silence, that the intercom crackled and a voice came over the speakers. Senior Flight Attendant Sarah Collins, please report to the cockpit immediately. Thank you." Her name being called over the intercom was a familiar sound, but something about the tone of the captain's voice made her feel uneasy. It wasn't urgent, but it was terse, almost cold. Sarah glanced toward the cockpit and then back at the passengers, who were now settled into their routines. She took a moment to gather herself before making her way toward the front of the plane. "Everything all right?" her junior attendant, Nina, asked with a curious glance as Sarah passed by. "I'm sure it's fine," Sarah replied with a forced smile, brushing off the growing unease she felt. She straightened her shoulders and made her way toward the cockpit. As the door slid open, Captain Reynolds was standing, his face unreadable. "Sarah, please come in and close the door behind you," he said, motioning toward the seat beside him. His usual calm demeanor was now tinged with an edge that Sarah hadn't expected. "What's this about, Captain?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "Sit down," Captain Reynolds instructed, his voice firm yet calm. "We need to discuss something." Sarah sat down, feeling a knot form in her stomach. Something wasn't right. The captain's expression was grave, and the normal small talk wasn't there. I don't understand. What's going on?" she asked, trying to maintain her composure. Captain Reynolds didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the first officer, who was watching the monitors. Then he turned back to Sarah, his voice lowering slightly. "You may have made a mistake earlier, Sarah." Her heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The captain's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Sarah noticed the subtle shift in his expression. His voice dropped even further. "The passenger you had removed, Jordan Williams, is not just a regular traveler." Sarah blinked, confusion creeping into her thoughts. Jordan Williams? He was just some guy who didn't belong in first class. The captain cut her off, his face going pale as he continued. "Jordan Williams is one of the largest investors in this airline. He owns 30% of the company and sits on our board of directors." Sarah's world seemed to stop for a moment. She stared at him, her mind racing to process the words. Jordan Williams, the man she had so casually dismissed as out of place, was a major shareholder in the very airline she worked for? The realization hit her like a wave of ice-cold water. Her breath caught in her throat. The full weight of what she had done settled in. She could feel the nausea rising in her chest, her stomach churning with regret and disbelief. How had she missed the signs? How could she have been so blind, so eager to act based on assumptions? Her immediate thought wasn't about her career or the potential fallout, although that quickly followed. It was about how she had treated him. She had assumed, without knowing anything about him, that he didn't belong, that someone like him, someone dressed simply, without the usual trappings of wealth, couldn't possibly be in first class. And now, she was staring at the harsh reality of her mistake. "What? What do I do now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her palms felt clammy, her heart racing as panic began to set in. Captain Reynolds let out a sigh, rubbing his temples. "You'll need to report to the office when we land. This situation is being escalated." Sarah's mind was spinning. The thought of facing the consequences of her actions was terrifying. What repercussions would she face? She had just alienated one of the most powerful people in the company, someone whose influence could easily bring down everything she had worked for. She could already feel the eyes of the crew and passengers on her, the whispers, the judgment. Her thoughts were clouded with fear, shame, and a rising tide of regret. But she knew deep down that there was no escaping what she had done. The damage had been done. As the captain dismissed her, Sarah walked back to the cabin, her head low. She felt as though the weight of the entire flight was bearing down on her. The air seemed thicker, heavier. Her movements felt robotic as she passed through the aisles, but her mind couldn't shake the image of Jordan's calm face as he was escorted off the plane. The man she had dismissed as unworthy of the seat in first class was now the man who could destroy her career. As Jordan stepped off the plane, escorted by security, he didn't let the tension of the moment rattle him. His posture remained tall and composed, his face betraying no emotion. The fluorescent lights of the terminal flickered above him as he walked toward a quiet corner, his mind sharp, calculating the next steps. The sting of humiliation was there, but he knew better than to let it consume him. As he reached the corner near the gate, away from the hustle of the airport, Jordan pulled out his phone with steady hands. He dialed his legal team. The line rang once, then twice, before a calm voice answered on the other end. "Jordan, what happened?" It was James, one of his most trusted legal advisors. "I need you to gather the team," Jordan said softly but firmly, his voice holding a tone of calm control that James knew well. "We've got a situation that goes beyond personal compensation or any financial settlements. It's bigger than me, bigger than this one incident." If James could hear the conviction in Jordan's voice. "What's going on?" "I was just removed from a flight, a first-class flight," Jordan said, his words slow and deliberate, each one weighed with the knowledge of what had just transpired. "I was humiliated, simply because of my appearance. I was judged and removed because the flight attendant didn't think someone like me belonged in first class." James was silent for a moment, processing what Jordan had just shared. That's unbelievable. But you're all right?" "I'm fine," Jordan reassured him, though there was an underlying frustration in his voice. "But this isn't just about me. This is about the systemic problem in the airline industry. The biases, the racism, the assumptions made about people of color. How many others have been subjected to this and had no voice to fight back?" Jordan's mind raced, his thoughts already moving beyond the incident. He wasn't interested in pursuing a personal vendetta. He wasn't angry in the way one might expect. His anger wasn't aimed at the flight attendant who had made the mistake. It wasn't even aimed at the airline. No, his frustration ran deeper. It was with the entire system that allowed such bias to go unchecked, the kind of systemic racism that was ingrained in industries, institutions, and even everyday interactions. "I don't want financial compensation. I don't want to seek revenge. What I want is change." Jordan's voice became resolute, the anger he had been holding in now channeled into purpose. "I want the airline to change its practices. I want this kind of discrimination to end, not just for me, but for anyone who faces this kind of treatment." James, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, paused for a moment, then spoke with urgency. "Understood. I'll get the team together and draft a formal response. What exactly do you want to do?" Jordan took a deep breath, his thoughts becoming more focused. "I want the airline to introduce mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees. And not just a one-time seminar, but something ongoing, something with real accountability. I want them to address unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and proper customer service protocols. This needs to be an integral part of how they operate. James was already typing notes as Jordan continued. I also want them to set up a clear reporting system for any incidents of discrimination. Employees should be able to report when something isn't right without fear of retaliation. They need a mechanism in place to ensure accountability. And I want to make sure there's an external review process too, so it's not just internal politics sweeping these issues under the rug. Jordan paused, his eyes scanning the busy terminal around him. People passed by, oblivious to what had just happened, to the injustice that had unfolded just moments before. But to Jordan, this was more than just a personal inconvenience. It was a chance to make a larger, lasting impact. He knew that without systemic change, incidents like his would continue to happen to others, people who didn't have the resources or the platform to fight back. I'm in a position to do something about this, he said, the words ringing with determination. And I'm going to use it. This isn't about my pride. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. And it's about making sure the airline industry doesn't continue to sweep these issues under the rug. James was silent for a moment, letting Jordan's words sink in. I'll get to work on this right away, he said, his voice full of resolve. We'll make sure the airline hears you loud and clear. You're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for everyone who's been discriminated against. Jordan nodded, even though James couldn't see it. Exactly. This isn't just my fight. It's the fight of everyone who's ever been judged based on the color of their skin, the way they dress, or the assumptions made about their worth. It's time for a change. As Jordan ended the call, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his decision settle in. This wasn't the path he had expected when he boarded that flight, but now that he was here, he knew he had to see it through. The humiliation of being removed from the plane, the cold disregard of someone who had judged him based on appearance alone, was not something he could let slide. He wasn't going to let this incident fade into the background. No, he would make sure it became a turning point. This moment, he decided, would be the catalyst for the change he had always wanted to see in the world. As the news of Jordan Williams' removal from the flight began to filter through the airline's upper echelons, the atmosphere at the corporate offices grew tense. The executives who had spent years building their brand were now facing a crisis that could shatter the carefully crafted image of their company. The phone lines buzzed with calls from the legal team, public relations advisors, and a growing number of concerned stakeholders. This can't go public, one senior executive said, his voice low and urgent as he paced around the glass-walled conference room. The potential for legal action is huge, not to mention the media storm. We can't afford to look like we're fostering discriminatory practices, especially not with someone like Jordan Williams involved. Jordan's status as a major shareholder and his influence on the airline industry made him an important figure. He wasn't just any disgruntled customer. The reality of the situation set in quickly. The company was at risk of not only losing a key investor, but also facing a public relations nightmare. There were whispers of lawsuits, potential boycotts, and the kind of media scrutiny that could cripple the airline's reputation for years. In response to the growing pressure, the executives scrambled to find a solution. "We need a response, and we need it now," another executive declared, slamming a fist onto the polished table. "We need to demonstrate that we take this seriously and that we are committed to immediate action." As the team worked behind closed doors, drafting emergency policies and preparing a formal response, they knew one thing for sure: Jordan's demands would not be ignored. As a shareholder with a 30% stake in the airline, his voice carried weight. He had access to the boardroom, and his influence over the company was undeniable. The severity of the situation only became clearer as the legal team quickly got involved, advising on how best to navigate the crisis. Jordan's legal team wasted no time. They sent a detailed letter to the airline, outlining his demands and the steps that needed to be taken in order to avoid further legal consequences. They recommended not only immediate diversity training for all employees, but also the implementation of ongoing education programs focused on unconscious bias and cultural sensitivity. The letter was explicit in its instructions. The airline was to create a reporting system where passengers could report incidents of discrimination, without fear of retaliation. "We are requesting an immediate company-wide review of your policies," the letter read, "and a commitment to create a more inclusive, diverse, and respectful environment for all passengers and employees. Failure to act swiftly will result in further action." The airline's leadership took these demands seriously. They began drafting new policies to address the gaps in their customer service practices. Senior executives began working with the airline's diversity consultants to build a training program that would address not just the surface issues, but the deeper, systemic problems that had allowed discrimination to fester within their ranks. As Jordan's influence grew clearer, the airline's board decided to form an official diversity and inclusion board. The board would include both internal and external members to oversee the company's efforts to create lasting change. This board would not only review complaints, but also ensure that diversity was a priority at all levels of the company, from hiring practices to customer service training. But Jordan's action didn't stop with one airline. As the news of his quiet but powerful response spread, it caught the attention of other airlines in the industry. "If this airline is doing this, maybe we should take a closer look at our own practices," a rival airline's executive remarked after hearing about the situation. The ripple effect was immediate. The issue of discrimination and bias in the airline industry was thrust into the public eye, and other major carriers began to examine their own policies and training practices in response. Within weeks, a wave of change spread throughout the industry. More and more airlines announced that they would be implementing similar diversity training programs. In some cases, they even invited external auditors to assess their practices and ensure that no one would be treated the way Jordan had been. While Jordan's name wasn't always mentioned directly, his influence was undeniable. He had used the platform that came with his wealth and status to enact real change, and the entire industry was beginning to take notice. Jordan, for his part, remained mostly out of the public eye. He didn't want the spotlight. The focus, in his mind, should remain on the systemic change that was needed. He never wanted to be a martyr or a symbol of change. He simply wanted to create the kind of environment where people would be treated with the respect they deserved, regardless of the color of their skin or the clothes they wore. The news coverage of the incident and the subsequent actions taken by the airline sent shockwaves through the media, but it also sparked a much-needed conversation about race, bias, and the need for continued education and reform within all industries. It became clear that Jordan's actions had set a precedent that would inspire further change beyond just the airline industry. "This isn't just about one incident," Jordan said in a private conversation with one of his closest friends, reflecting on the broader impact. "It's about creating a society where these kinds of assumptions no longer have a place, and where people are treated equally no matter their appearance. This is just the beginning." Jordan's quiet decision to take action had set off a chain of events that would reverberate through the industry for years to come. It wasn't the kind of revenge or financial compensation he had initially been offered. It was something far more valuable, a lasting change in how people were treated, a shift in perspective that could ensure no one else would ever have to endure the kind of humiliation he had suffered that day. And as the ripples of his decision continued to spread, Jordan found a quiet sense of satisfaction in knowing that he had sparked something much larger than himself. A movement toward a more equitable and respectful world for everyone. The days following Jordan's removal from the flight were a blur of tension and uncertainty for Sarah Collins. As soon as the plane had landed and she had returned to her usual duties, the atmosphere had shifted. The passengers, who once greeted her with polite smiles, now avoided her gaze, and the flight attendants who worked with her were quieter, their expressions subtly altered. Sarah, though she tried to maintain her professional composure, couldn't ignore the mounting sense of discomfort. She had made a decision, one that, she would soon realize, would not only impact her personally but would ripple out to affect her entire career. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came when Sarah was called into the senior management office. The air inside the office felt thick with tension as she was asked to take a seat, the door clicking shut behind her with an ominous finality. The executive team was gathered around a long, polished table, papers strewn across it, their expressions serious and unreadable. Sarah, the regional manager began. "We need to discuss your actions during Flight 2317. We've received a formal complaint, and the investigation is underway." Sarah's stomach dropped as she tried to maintain her composure. "I handled the situation the way I thought was best. I was only trying to ensure the safety and integrity of the first-class cabin," she defended, her voice shaky but determined. The regional manager didn't respond immediately, instead gesturing to a report in front of him. "We've gone through your records, Sarah," he continued, "and what we've discovered is more concerning than we anticipated." A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she realized that the incident with Jordan was not an isolated case. The manager slid a file across the table toward her. "There are multiple complaints from passengers over the years, passengers of color, passengers in casual attire, who felt unfairly targeted or mistreated by you. We've documented over a dozen instances, all describing a pattern of discriminatory behavior." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Her mind raced as she processed the accusations. She had prided herself on her ability to handle difficult situations, to maintain control and uphold the standards of the airline. But now, faced with the undeniable truth, her actions, ones she had justified as maintaining order and professionalism, were being revealed for what they were: prejudiced judgments based solely on appearances. "But those were just isolated incidents," Sarah protested weakly, feeling her voice falter. "I never meant to hurt anyone, I was just doing my job." The regional manager's eyes softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "That's the problem, Sarah. Your actions were not isolated, and your interpretation of doing your job has caused real harm. Discriminatory behavior has no place in our company, especially when we hold ourselves to a standard of equality for all passengers." A silence fell over the room as Sarah sat frozen, the weight of the realization settling over her. The evidence was clear, and there was no escaping the consequences. This wasn't just about one bad decision, it was part of a larger pattern that had spanned years. The passengers she had judged based on nothing more than their clothing or skin color had been right to feel disrespected, and now the airline was facing serious fallout from her actions. And after a long, uncomfortable pause, the regional manager continued. "Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay, pending the results of a full internal investigation. You will be required to participate in additional diversity and sensitivity training before any decisions regarding your future with the company can be made." The words felt like a slap, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The reality of her suspension, of the professional ruin she had just brought upon herself, began to sink in. She had spent over a decade climbing the ranks, proving herself in a career she had worked so hard to build. Now, all of it was hanging by a thread. As she walked out of the meeting, her steps felt heavy, like lead weights pulling her down. The humiliation of the suspension wasn't just about losing her job. It was the realization that she had become the very thing she had despised, someone who judged others based on superficial characteristics. Her mind flashed back to the way she had treated Jordan that day, how she had assumed he didn't belong, how she had singled him out for something as simple as his casual attire. How had she not seen it then? How had she not recognized that she was perpetuating the same kind of bias she'd heard so many others talk about, but never fully understood? The hallway felt impossibly long as she made her way to the employee break room. Her hands trembled as she tried to dial her husband's number, but the call went unanswered. "I can't do this to him," she thought, as she stared at the phone screen, her mind spiraling. Her reputation, everything she had worked for, was on the verge of collapsing. She thought of the other flight attendants, the ones who had looked at her with that silent judgment earlier. Had they known all along? Had they seen her for what she truly was? Her chest tightened as the guilt and shame washed over her. She had let herself become someone she didn't recognize. When Sarah finally made it home that evening, she sat in the car for several minutes, unable to summon the strength to go inside. She had spent so many years building a life of stability and success, but now that life felt like it was slipping away. She was ashamed, not just of the way she had treated Jordan, but of the bigger truth she had been blind to, the way her biases had been allowed to shape her decisions without her even realizing it. When she finally entered the house, her husband Paul was sitting in the kitchen. His usual warm smile faltered as he saw her face. "Sarah, what's wrong?" She couldn't find the words at first, but as she sat down at the table, she found herself saying, "I messed up, Paul. I've lost everything." The shame was overwhelming. She had jeopardized not just her career, but also the trust of those around her. The weight of her actions hung heavily in the room, and she realized there was no easy way to fix what she had broken. All she could do now was face the consequences and hope somehow to rebuild from the ashes of her mistake. The incident involving Jordan Williams did not remain confined to the sterile walls of the airline's corporate offices. Within hours, the story went viral. Social media exploded with outrage as people shared their own stories of discrimination they had faced, particularly in the airline industry. Hashtags like "Justice for Jordan" and "End Discrimination in Airlines" trended worldwide. Passengers began to recount their experiences of being unfairly judged based on their race, clothing, or appearance, and the shared sense of injustice resonated deeply with people from all walks of life. It wasn't long before Sarah Collins, the flight attendant at the heart of the incident, became a symbol of the kind of prejudices that many had experienced but couldn't always confront. Her actions, once dismissed as an isolated mistake, were now exposed as part of a troubling pattern of behavior that had been ongoing for years. Her name was everywhere, on social media feeds, in news articles, and in interviews with people who had witnessed or been subjected to similar treatment by airline staff. The backlash was swift and relentless. Videos and posts flooded the internet, recounting Jordan's humiliating removal from the flight. Public opinion turned against Sarah as her history of discrimination became known. The airline industry was forced to address the larger issue at hand, but Sarah was now the face of an unfortunate reality that had been ignored for far too long. Inside the airline's own staff, Sarah's situation was no better. Some colleagues expressed shock and disappointment, distancing themselves from her completely. They were uncomfortable with her actions, and even though they may have privately sympathized with her, they could not and would not defend her. Others, though hesitant, spoke up, acknowledging that what Sarah had done was wrong, but they refrained from offering any real support. She was now a pariah within the company, a cautionary tale of how unchecked biases could destroy a career, no matter how many years of service one had put in. Sarah, once a respected senior flight attendant, felt the weight of her actions bearing down on her. The isolation was unbearable. The constant reminders of her mistake, whether through the cruel comments online or the uncomfortable silences in the workplace, made it feel as though there was no escape. Even her family, though supportive, were affected by the public scrutiny. Her husband, Paul, didn't speak much, but the tension in the house was palpable. The once strong network of people who had once looked up to her now seemed to turn their backs, and Sarah felt herself spiraling deeper into shame. With her professional reputation in ruins, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. It was clear that she couldn't go back to her old life, to the career she had built so carefully. She had to start over, but where? And how? One morning, as she scrolled through job listings online, Sarah found an opening for a waitress at a local diner. The job was far removed from her previous life. There were no uniforms, no polished service, no corporate hierarchy. The pay was modest, but the work was honest. It was humbling, but it also seemed like the fresh start she needed. With little else to turn to, Sarah applied. Her first day at the diner was a shock to the system. The kitchen was cramped, the pace fast, and the tips meager. She had to wear a plain apron, and the interactions with customers were stripped of any pretense. There was no first-class cabin to hide in, no uniform to set her apart. Here, she was just another server doing her job alongside others who were used to hard work. And for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt the weight of humility. As she moved from table to table, Sarah interacted with a diverse group of customers. There were young parents, elderly couples, working-class individuals, people from all walks of life. They weren't concerned with her uniform, her appearance, or her social status. They simply wanted their food, a warm smile, and decent service. In the process, Sarah began to see people differently. She noticed the elderly woman who struggled to lift her heavy purse, the tired father who gently calmed his crying child, and the young couple who laughed about their hectic day. In their eyes, she didn't see judgment or assumptions. She saw human beings with their own struggles and dreams. As days turned into weeks, Sarah found herself reflecting on her past actions. The kindness she had received from customers, no matter their background, made her realize just how wrong she had been. She had spent so much time judging people by the way they looked, never considering the full story behind their appearance. Now, working in a diner, she was able to experience firsthand the value of empathy and kindness. With every interaction, Sarah grew more aware of the damage her prejudice had caused. The guilt of what she had done to Jordan and to all the others like him weighed heavily on her heart. But she also began to understand something new, that it was possible to change, to become better. The work was slow, but Sarah was committed to it. She didn't know if she would ever fully redeem herself in the eyes of others, but she was determined to make amends in her own way. Through the simple, everyday interactions at the diner, Sarah began to rebuild her sense of self. She treated every customer with respect, offering them kindness without judgment. Slowly, she started to regain her confidence, not because she was in control or above others, but because she had learned to see them for who they truly were. Sarah knew that her journey wasn't over, that it would take time to fully understand the depth of her mistakes. But she also knew that she had taken the first step. She had admitted her flaws and started the difficult but necessary work of changing. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was ready to face whatever came next. In the months that followed the incident, Jordan Williams found himself reflecting on the unexpected trajectory his life had taken. What had started as an unfortunate encounter on a plane, one that was initially humiliating and painful, had blossomed into something far greater. His decision to push for systemic change, rather than seeking personal revenge, was a deliberate choice, one that he felt was far more important than any momentary satisfaction he could gain from punitive measures. For Jordan, this wasn't about confronting Sarah Collins directly or seeking retribution for the embarrassment he had faced. It was about changing the way things worked in an industry where discriminatory practices were still rampant, often hidden beneath the surface. Jordan's actions sparked a movement, one that reverberated far beyond his personal experience. His decision to approach the situation from a place of understanding and empathy, instead of anger, became a model of empowerment. His legacy was not one of resentment, but one of resilience and forward-thinking leadership. By using his wealth and status as a means to call for change, Jordan proved that true power comes not from accumulating resources, but from using those resources to help others and to right societal wrongs. His influence didn't stop with the airline. As the industry began implementing the diversity training programs he had demanded, Jordan saw the ripple effect spreading across sectors. The airline's new training model focused on unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and inclusive practices was quickly adopted by other airlines. The initial resistance from some quarters within the company soon gave way to genuine enthusiasm for the change. Sarah Collins, once a part of that very system, became the unintentional face of the problem, but Jordan's decision to address the issue without personal animus allowed the industry to focus on the bigger picture, the need for compassion and respect for all people, regardless of their race, background, or attire. News outlets praised Jordan for his remarkable response. Instead of allowing the incident to define him as a victim, he chose to define the moment as an opportunity for transformation. In doing so, he became a voice for countless individuals who had been subjected to similar mistreatment, but who lacked the resources or platform to take action. He used his platform not to seek revenge, but to champion a cause that would affect the lives of many far beyond the walls of that airplane cabin. The airline's diversity and inclusion initiative became a model for companies around the world. Airlines, hotel chains, corporate offices, and even educational institutions took note, and soon similar programs were launched globally. What had initially seemed like a single moment of injustice had sparked an industry-wide movement, shifting the way businesses approached diversity, equity, and inclusion. Jordan's quiet decision to take action, to channel his power into creating positive change, resulted in a lasting transformation in the airline industry and beyond. As for Sarah, her story took a different turn. After the storm of public backlash and personal reflection, she continued her journey of change. The diner became her place of personal redemption, a daily opportunity to examine her actions and seek out new ways to engage with the world. Each day she spent serving customers, she was reminded of her past mistakes, but also given the chance to make amends in small but meaningful ways. Sarah had once believed that power came from authority, being in control, managing the environment around her and adhering to the rules. But through the humility of serving others, she learned that true power came from empathy and the ability to understand people beyond the surface. In the faces of the tired parents, the elderly customers, and the young professionals, Sarah began to see the diversity of the human experience. Free from the biases she had once allowed to shape her worldview, she made a conscious effort to listen more, to engage with people without judgment, and to offer her kindness without hesitation. Every small act of service, from helping an elderly woman with her coat to offering a smile to a weary traveler, became a lesson in compassion. In the evenings, Sarah reflected on her journey. Her days at the diner were long, filled with hard work and often little recognition. Yet it was here, away from the comforts of her previous life, that she found a sense of peace she hadn't known before. She realized that the shame she had carried from her past mistakes was not something she could erase overnight, but through consistent effort, she could change the way she saw the world and the people around her. The diner became more than just a job. It became the space where Sarah rebuilt herself. Her transformation wasn't immediate, nor was it easy. But with every day that passed, Sarah grew more aware of the depth of her own flaws and the profound need for personal growth. She knew that she would never be perfect, but she was determined to keep learning, to continue striving toward becoming a better person. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah found a renewed sense of purpose. She started to volunteer in the community, offering her time to causes that mattered to her, ones that focused on uplifting underrepresented voices and fighting discrimination in all its forms. The work wasn't glamorous and the pay wasn't much, but Sarah found a deep sense of fulfillment in it. Her journey of redemption was not about regaining what she had lost, it was about gaining something far more valuable. The understanding that true growth comes from acknowledging one's mistakes, making amends, and constantly striving to do better. Sarah had once thought that success was about recognition, about being seen and admired. But now, she realized that success was about how she treated others, how she made people feel valued, respected, and heard. In time, Sarah earned back the trust of some of her colleagues and customers, though she knew it would take much longer for others to forgive her. Still, she was committed to the process, and as the world around her continued to change, Sarah too continued to change. Her journey was ongoing, but it had already begun to shape her into someone who would never again look at the world through the lens of prejudice. She had learned a powerful lesson, one that she would carry with her every day. Empathy and respect for others are not just values to be spoken of, they are values to be lived, with every action, every word, and every decision. Both Jordan and Sarah, in their own ways, had become symbols of the change they wanted to see in the world. Jordan had used his influence for a broader, industry-wide transformation, while Sarah had embarked on a more personal journey of redemption. Both stories showed that real change starts with acknowledging one's faults, taking responsibility for them, and committing to doing better. Whether in a corporate boardroom or behind a diner counter, through their stories, the world learned an invaluable lesson. True strength lies not in perfection, but in the courage to grow and the humility to admit when we have fallen short. Now that you've heard the stories of Jordan and Sarah, it's time for you to share your voice. We all have experiences, whether big or small, where we've witnessed or stood up against discrimination. These moments, when we choose to act with courage and compassion, can change lives. And just as Jordan used his influence to push for systemic change, each one of us has the power to spark positive transformation, starting in our own communities. We want to hear from you, your story of standing up for what's right. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to challenge bias or unfair treatment? How did you feel? What did you learn? Share your experiences in the comments below, and let's keep this important conversation going. If you believe, like we do, that standing up for equality is the key to making a difference, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your friends and family, and subscribe for more stories of courage, growth, and change. Together, we can create a world where everyone's dignity is recognized and respected. And remember, change doesn't happen overnight, but every step we take brings us closer to a future where fairness and equality are the norm. Let's all commit to being a part of that change.